August 17, 1943. Dawn breaks over the San Joaquin Valley with the slow, golden patience of a California summer. The air hangs heavy with the scent of ripening peaches, so thick you could almost taste the sweetness before your fingers touched the fruit. In the orchards east of Fresno, the leaves rustle in a breeze that carries no malice, no threat, only the promise of another hot, abundant day. 1,000 Italian prisoners of war stand in rows between the trees, their hands still uncertain, their faces upturned toward branches laden with fruit so perfect it seems unreal. They have been soldiers. They have known hunger. They have seen cities reduced to rubble and felt the gnawing cold of North African nights. But this morning, as the first peach falls into a canvas bag with a soft thud, something shifts in the chest of a young corporal from Calabria. He does not yet have the words for it. He only knows that the fruit in his hand is warm, that his stomach is full, and that the guard watching him from beneath a walnut tree is chewing gum and reading a newspaper. There are no rifles pointed. There are no screams. There is only the quiet hum of labor, the scent of earth and sugar, and the strange, disorienting realization that he is alive in a place where even captivity feels like mercy. This is not the war they were told about. This is not the America they were taught to fear. And in the letters they will write home, cramped and careful on Red Cross stationery, they will struggle to explain what they have found here. A paradise behind barbed wire, a contradiction so profound it will reshape their understanding of the world. The story of Italian prisoners of war in California begins not in the orchards, but in the ruins of Mussolini's crumbling empire. By the summer of 1943, Italy's war effort had collapsed into chaos. In North Africa, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers surrendered to British and American forces, exhausted, malnourished, and betrayed by a regime that had promised them glory but delivered only dust and death. When Italy signed the armistice on September 8, 1943, the floodgates opened. Italian POWs became a logistical problem of staggering scale. The British, stretched thin across multiple theaters, handed over tens of thousands to the Americans. By the end of the war, the United States held more than 50,000 Italian prisoners on its own soil, scattered across camps from Texas to New York, from Montana to California. But California was different. California was not just a place of confinement. It was a place of abundance so extreme, so alien to the European experience of total war, that it became a kind of accidental propaganda, a living refutation of everything the Axis powers had claimed about American decadence and weakness. The prisoners who arrived in the agricultural valleys of California in 1943 and 1944 expected, if they thought about it at all, the grim austerity of captivity. They expected rations that barely sustained life. They expected cruelty, or at least indifference. What they found instead was a land overflowing with food, a civilian population untouched by bombing, and a labor system that desperately needed their hands. The American home front was straining under the pressures of total war. Millions of young men had left the farms for the factories and the front lines, and the agricultural heartland faced a crisis of labor. In California, where vast orchards and vineyards stretched across the Central Valley, the harvest was at risk. Peaches rotted on the trees. Grapes withered on the vine. The War Manpower Commission authorized the use of POW labor under the Geneva Conventions, which permitted prisoners to work in non-military industries under humane conditions. And so, in a twist of historical irony, the soldiers who had fought against America found themselves picking the fruit that would feed the nation that had defeated them. They arrived in trucks, their uniforms faded and patched, their faces gaunt from months in North African prison camps. The camps in California were not prisons in the traditional sense. They were hastily constructed compounds of wooden barracks and tents, surrounded by barbed wire more symbolic than secure. At Camp Beale, north of Sacramento, Italian prisoners lived in conditions that astonished even the American guards. They were given 3 meals a day, meals that included meat, bread, fresh vegetables, and fruit, in quantities that seemed obscene to men who had survived on hardtack and thin soup for years. They were issued new clothing, provided with medical care, and paid 80 cents a day in scrip for their labor, a wage that, while modest by American standards, was a fortune compared to the nothing they had known as soldiers of a collapsing empire. But it was not the material comfort alone that broke something open inside them. It was the nature of the work. It was the act of reaching into the branches of a peach tree and pulling down fruit so ripe it bruised under your thumb. It was the rhythm of the harvest, the simple, primal satisfaction of filling a basket, of seeing the day's labor pile up in crates that would be loaded onto trucks and sent to markets and kitchens across America. For men who had spent years in the machinery of violence, the shift to the machinery of abundance was disorienting. They had been trained to destroy. Here, they were asked to gather. The peach became the symbol of everything they had not known. In the letters they wrote home, the peach appeared again and again, described in language that bordered on the reverential. One prisoner from Tuscany wrote to his mother, "We pick fruit all day. Peaches so sweet and heavy you cannot hold 3 in one hand. We eat them at lunch, and no one stops us. The juice runs down our arms, and I think of you, Mama, and wonder if you have tasted anything so good in these years of war." Another, from Sicily, wrote to his wife, "I do not know how to tell you this without sounding like I have lost my mind, but I am in a prison where we are fed better than I was fed as a boy. Yesterday we had chicken. Chicken, Maria. The Americans have so much food they give it to their enemies." These letters, scrutinized by censors and stamped by the Red Cross, made their way across the Atlantic to villages and cities ravaged by war. In Italy, people were starving. The country had become a battleground, torn between the retreating Germans, the advancing Allies, and the bitter civil conflict between fascists and partisans. Food was scarce. Cities were bombed. Families huddled in cellars and prayed for the war to end. And into this darkness came letters from California. Letters that spoke of abundance, of safety, of a captivity that felt less like punishment and more like reprieve. Some families did not believe them. Some thought their sons and husbands had been brainwashed. Others wept with relief, understanding that whatever else had been lost, their men were alive and, impossibly, they were eating peaches. The prisoners did not arrive in California as believers in American democracy. They arrived as soldiers of fascism, men who had been raised on the rhetoric of Mussolini, who had been taught that America was a mongrel nation, weak and materialistic, a country without discipline or spine. They had been told that the Americans would crumble under pressure, that their wealth had made them soft, that their diversity was a fatal flaw. And yet here they were, surrounded by evidence that contradicted every lesson of their youth. The transformation was not immediate. It was gradual, seeping in through small moments of cognitive dissonance. It was the farmer who stopped by the orchard to check on the harvest and spoke to them in broken Italian, asking after their health. It was the guard who shared a cigarette and showed them pictures of his own family. It was the realization that the Americans did not hate them, did not see them as monsters, but as men who had been caught up in the madness of history. The Italian prisoners were not subjected to the harsh treatment that Japanese-American citizens faced in internment camps, nor were they viewed with the same suspicion as German POWs, who were often seen as ideologically committed Nazis. The Italians occupied a strange middle ground. They were enemies, yes, but they were also seen as victims of fascism, as men who had been led astray by bad leaders. And in the peculiar alchemy of American pragmatism, they became, in some small way, guests. This distinction was not lost on them. At Camp Florence, Arizona, Italian prisoners were allowed to attend Catholic Mass in local churches, escorted by guards who waited outside. At Camp Stockton, California, some prisoners were permitted to work on private farms, living in bunkhouses alongside Mexican and Filipino laborers, sharing meals and stories. The boundaries of captivity were porous, negotiated daily in 1,000 small interactions. And through those boundaries, an idea began to take root. The idea was simple, almost naive in its simplicity. It was the idea that America, for all its contradictions and flaws, was a place where abundance was not hoarded by the few but shared, however imperfectly, among the many. It was the idea that democracy, messy and chaotic as it was, produced a society wealthy enough to feed even its enemies. It was the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the fascist vision of the world, rigid, hierarchical, built on the glorification of suffering and sacrifice, was not the only way, or even the best way, to organize a civilization. The historical record bears out the peculiarity of this experience. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's Office kept meticulous records of POW labor during the war, and the data is striking. Italian prisoners of war worked more than 14 million man-days of labor in the United States between 1943 and 1946, much of it in agriculture. In California alone, thousands of Italians harvested crops worth millions of dollars, filling the labor gap left by American men at war. The prisoners were paid, fed, housed, and, according to Red Cross inspections, treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Mortality rates among Italian POWs in the United States were astonishingly low, far lower than among American POWs held by the Japanese, and lower even than among some civilian populations in war-torn Europe. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The emotional reality was captured in the letters, in the diaries, in the interviews conducted decades later with men who returned to Italy and never forgot their time in California. One such man, interviewed in the 1980s by an American historian, recalled his arrival at a camp near Salinas. "I thought we would be treated badly," he said. "I thought they would make us suffer for what we had done. But instead, they gave us work. They gave us food. They gave us dignity. I do not think I understood what America was until I picked lettuce in that valley. I thought it was just a rich country. I did not know it was a different kind of country." This sentiment was echoed by others. A former prisoner from Naples, who settled in Brooklyn after the war, told his grandchildren that his time in California had been the turning point of his life. "I learned in that camp," he said, "that you do not need a dictator to make a country strong. I learned that freedom and prosperity are not opposites. I learned that the Americans were not weak because they were kind. They were strong because they were kind." Such reflections were not universal. Some prisoners remained loyal to fascism, resentful of their capture, unmoved by abundance. But they were a minority. The majority, confronted daily with the evidence of their senses, began to shift. And that shift, multiplied across tens of thousands of men, would have consequences that rippled far beyond the war. The peach, that humble fruit, became the lens through which they understood their transformation. It was not merely food. It was proof. Proof that the world was not as they had been told. Proof that America, for all its flaws, was not the decadent enemy of propaganda, but a place of startling generosity. The prisoners ate peaches at lunch, sitting in the shade of the trees they had just harvested, the juice sticky on their fingers. They saved peaches to eat later, hoarding them in their barracks like treasures. They wrote about peaches in letters that would cross the ocean and arrive in villages where fruit was a distant memory. And in that simple act, the eating of a peach, the writing of a letter, they began to rebuild their understanding of the world. The symbolism was not lost on the American authorities. The War Department understood, in a vague, bureaucratic way, that treating prisoners well served strategic purposes. It demonstrated American adherence to international law. It provided a contrast to the brutality of the Axis powers, and it planted seeds of goodwill that might bear fruit in the post-war world. But the men in the orchards were not thinking in such grand terms. They were thinking about the peach in their hand, the sun on their back, the strange miracle of being alive and fed in the middle of a war that had devoured so many. As the war dragged on, the nature of the camps began to change. After Italy switched sides and became a co-belligerent of the Allies in October 1943, the status of Italian POWs became ambiguous. Some were reclassified as Italian service units, quasi-military labor battalions that worked directly for the U.S. Army. Others remained POWs, but were given greater freedoms, allowed to attend dances, to socialize with local communities, to take English classes. In California, relationships formed between prisoners and the families of the farmers they worked for. Some prisoners were invited to Sunday dinners. Some exchanged addresses and promised to stay in touch after the war. A few fell in love with local women, relationships that would, in some cases, lead to marriages after the war ended. This integration, limited and fraught as it was, stood in stark contrast to the treatment of Japanese Americans, who were incarcerated in desolate camps far from the fertile valleys where Italian prisoners picked fruit. The irony was bitter and unmistakable. Enemy soldiers were treated with more dignity than American citizens of Japanese descent. It was a stain on the American experiment, a reminder that the ideals of freedom and equality were unevenly applied, shaped by racism and fear. The Italian prisoners, for the most part, did not see this contradiction. They saw only their own experience, their own slow awakening to the possibilities of a different kind of society. But history remembers both truths. It remembers the generosity extended to the Italian prisoners, and it remembers the injustice inflicted on Japanese Americans. The same country that fed its enemies and taught them about democracy was simultaneously betraying its own principles. This duality is the essence of the American story, a constant, unresolved tension between the ideal and the real, between the promise and the practice. The war ended. The prisoners went home. They returned to an Italy that was shattered, traumatized, and deeply divided. The fascist regime was gone, but the scars remained. The country faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just its cities, but its identity. And in that reconstruction, the men who had spent the war in California played a quiet but significant role. They brought back with them a vision of what was possible. They had seen a society that, for all its flaws, functioned with a degree of prosperity and freedom that seemed almost fantastical. They had seen that democracy was not chaos, that abundance was not decadence, that kindness was not weakness. Some became advocates for democratic reform. Some went into politics, into labor organizing, into the rebuilding of civil society. Others simply went back to their farms and their families, carrying with them the memory of peaches and the knowledge that the world was larger and stranger than they had been taught. The historian of the Italian POW experience, Flavio Conti, noted in his research that many former prisoners became vocal opponents of neo-fascism in the post-war period, citing their time in America as a formative experience. They had seen the alternative. They had lived it, and they could not forget. There is a photograph taken in the summer of 1944 that captures something of this moment. It shows a group of Italian prisoners standing in an orchard near Fresno, their arms full of peaches, their faces relaxed and smiling. Behind them, an American soldier leans against a truck, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his posture casual. The barbed wire is visible in the background, but it is almost incidental, a formality. What dominates the image is the fruit, the abundance, the strange, improbable harmony of the scene. It is a photograph that could be mistaken for something other than what it is. It could be a harvest festival. It could be a family gathering. It is, instead, a document of war, of captivity, and of the complicated ways that human beings find connection even in the midst of conflict. The peach, in the end, was more than a symbol. It was a bridge between hunger and plenty, between war and peace, between the lies of propaganda and the truth of lived experience. It was a bridge that some men crossed and some did not, but for those who did, the journey was irrevocable. They could not go back to seeing the world as they had before. They had tasted the fruit of California, and in that taste, they had found a question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What if the enemy had been right all along? What if the future belonged not to the strong men and the iron fists, but to the messy, chaotic, generous experiment of democracy? Decades later, long after the barbed wire had been torn down and the camps had been dismantled, the letters remained. Kept in attics and basements, yellowed and fragile, they testified to a moment when the world had tilted on its axis and nothing had been the same again. The children and grandchildren of those prisoners, reading the careful script, tried to imagine what their fathers and grandfathers had felt, standing in a California orchard with the sun on their faces and a peach in their hands. It was hard to picture. The war had become history, distant and abstract. But the letters insisted on the reality of it, on the strangeness and the wonder. One letter, preserved in a family archive in Turin, ends with a line that has been quoted in histories of the Italian POW experience. "I do not know if I will ever see you again, Papa, but if I do, I will bring you a peach from this place. I will bring you the taste of what I have learned here, which is that the world is not as small or as cruel as we believed. There is more. There is always more." The story of Italian prisoners in California is not a story of good and evil. It is a story of paradox. It is the story of men who were enemies discovering that their enemy was not what they had been told. It is the story of a country that could be generous and unjust in the same breath, that could feed prisoners of war while incarcerating its own citizens, that could embody the highest ideals of democracy while betraying them in practice. It is a story that refuses easy conclusions, that insists on complexity. But if there is a lesson in it, it is this: that abundance and freedom are not just luxuries, not just the rewards of wealth. They are arguments. They are forms of persuasion more powerful than any propaganda. The peach in the hand of a prisoner is a claim about the world, a claim that says there is enough, that says we do not have to hoard and fight and fear. It is a claim that can change minds, that can plant seeds of doubt in the hardest soil. And those seeds, once planted, are difficult to uproot. The prisoners who picked fruit in California and wrote home about paradise behind barbed wire were not naive. They knew they were captives. They knew the war was still raging. They knew that their letters would be read by censors, that their lives were not their own. But they also knew what they tasted, what they saw, what they felt, and they understood, in some deep and inarticulate way, that they had stumbled upon a truth that would outlast the war, outlast the camps, outlast even their own lives. The truth was this: that a society built on shared abundance is stronger than a society built on shared sacrifice. That freedom, messy and inefficient as it is, produces more than tyranny ever can. That the future belongs not to the nations that demand the most from their people, but to the nations that give the most to them. It was a truth written in the sweetness of a peach, in the warmth of California sun, in the strange, unexpected mercy of captivity. And it was a truth that, once learned, could not be unlearned. August 17, 1943. The peach falls into the canvas bag. The war goes on. But in the orchard east of Fresno, something has shifted. A man from Calabria pauses, wipes the juice from his mouth, and looks up at the sky. It is a sky without bombers, without smoke, without the sound of guns. It is just a sky. And beneath it, for this moment, he is just a man, holding a piece of fruit, standing in a place that should not exist but does. Paradise behind barbed wire. The contradiction that will carry him home, changed.